All right, great. Well, we will get started today. So first of all, thanks for everybody for joining. I got a little information from a few people, and maybe towards the end of this, we'll have some time to take questions. I think this is supposed to be a 45-minute webinar. I'll try and keep it a little bit shorter than that. And then if we do need to go on past the 45 minutes, I'm happy to have a little conversation as well. So if you are in the right place, you should be in Waking Up from the American Dream, integrating self-care into your startup. Just a little bit about me. I am a growth strategist. So I help startups launch. I help a lot of early stage folks get off the ground. Once you are generating somewhere between the $1 and $10 million mark, I kind of move into a chief growth officer type of role, and I help larger companies grow. And then I do some coaching as well. So a lot of mentoring that I do is with entrepreneurs and founders. Folks in that realm tend to have very interesting and similar challenges. It is very interesting when you don't have anybody that is telling you what to do anymore, or telling you it's time to go home in the evening, and you tend to spend a lot of time working on your company. And you forget that self-care needs to really be a part of what you're doing and how to build that into your organization. So what I like to say is having an idea is the easy part. I can oftentimes help with the rest. Now, beyond that, I have spent over a decade now really in what I call self-care experimentation. I have done work in a lot of different traditions. I would say that my primary tradition is yoga. I study a lot of Vedanta as well. Meditation is a big path in my life. I have spent time in 12-step recovery. I've spent a lot of time in therapy. I've spent time in entheogen work. I've got all sorts of different backgrounds that I have pulled from and that I use in a lot of my coaching and self-care practices and some of the workshops that I do as well. So if you have any fears about any of this stuff, don't hesitate to bring it up on in the question section at the end of this call. I absolutely believe that every founder, every entrepreneur should have a coach, should have a therapist, should have some support structure, because this is one of the most challenging jobs that you're ever going to have. It's really hard to take care of yourself when all you are doing day in and day out is taking care of other people. So what we're going to do is divide this up into 4 different steps. The first step, I'm going to do my best to clear up what I consider is some confusion. And we're going to start off with the American dream. So if you're willing to turn your camera on to Zoom or raise your hand, it doesn't make any difference to me, or you can post it in the chat. How many of you would like to be a part of or fulfill the American dream? Raise your hand on the camera, put something in chat, raise your hand in the participant view, whatever is easiest for you to do. How many people would like to participate in the American dream? So I can see a fair number of people already saying yes. So what I find interesting about that is that we all say that we want to participate in the American dream, but not a whole lot of us are really sure what the American dream is. So I want to ask you another question now, and we're going to get back to the American dream here in just a couple of minutes. Let me ask you this. And you don't have to type this in right now, but I would like you to think about it through the course of this presentation. And then I'm going to ask you to type it into the chat. Once you're comfortable with what we're talking about today, how would you feel right now at this very moment if I gave you a box full of $1 million? So if you have a pen or paper handy, or if you're typing on the computer, write down how you think you would feel if I gave you a box full of $1 million. So write that down right now, and I want you to keep thinking about it, because my guess is that you're going to look something like this. This is sort of the kid in the candy store look. We would absolutely love to have $1 million, and we also think that that $1 million is going to make us happy. Would you agree? Again, if you use that thumbs up or raising your hand, how many people would agree that getting $1 million is going to make you happy today? Anybody willing to share their participation?
I agree.
A few people. All right. So in theory, I would also agree with you, but now I want to actually clear up a little bit of confusion. So would it surprise you to know that about 70% of people who suddenly receive a windfall of cash will lose it within a few years? So this is from National Endowment for Financial Education. And where some of this, where some of these statistics come from are lottery winners. So if you've ever heard any of the stories that discuss lottery winners, a lot of times their life ends up being a lot more challenging and difficult once they receive the money than it was before that. And here's another really interesting stat. 1.7 million individuals were surveyed by the Gallup World Poll, and they found that satiation or somewhat happiness occurs at about $95,000. Now, this changes depending on where you live, what part of the country you're in, what part of the economy that you are participating in. But at about $95,000, people reach a satiation stage, meaning that they are fulfilled. Most people don't need more than $95,000 to feel fulfilled. And in fact, between $60,000 and $75,000 to achieve emotional well-being. Now, maybe you have that much money today. Maybe you're making that much money. I don't know. And maybe that is the goal and why you're here. And that might be why you want to start a startup, is to make a whole bunch of money. But I'm telling you this right now as a founder, that your level of happiness doesn't actually need to increase or will not increase a whole lot more once you get past $95,000, at least so says Gallup. So I want to go back to the American dream at this point, and I want to ask you again, do you actually know what the American dream is or where it came from? Now, it's been around for a long time, but it really became popular in about 1931. So an author, James Treslow Adams, wrote in his book, Epic of America, that dream of a land in which life should be better and richer and fuller for everyone, with the opportunity for each according to ability and achievement. Now, this last part I find is very interesting. That first of all, the American dream requires ability and achievement. And then the other part that I find very fascinating is that for many, many years now, we have decided that the American dream requires wealth. For me to achieve the American dream, I actually have to be rich. Now, one thing that you don't see inside of there, one word that you don't actually see inside of that definition is happy. American dream, in almost all of the research that I can find, never includes happiness. It means pulling ourselves by our bootstraps and being successful and having power and having wealth. The American dream doesn't really actually talk much about happiness. And as we have just found by a couple of those former statistics, happiness doesn't actually equate to monetary health. So the American dream that we have grown up with from the very beginning, and I'll tell you when this usually starts for us, this usually starts, at least in the American world, when we are starting to take standardized tests. Standardized tests in elementary school and middle school, if we score high on our tests, then we get put in advanced placement classes in high school. And advanced placement classes make us potentially smarter and give us better grades and a better reputation when we apply for colleges. And once we actually get a good college, then we get the opportunity to get a good job, and a good job actually gives us the opportunity to make a whole bunch of money and potentially have a very attractive partner and a big house and 3 cars. And let me tell you something, the richest people that I know are some of the most miserable people that I know. Because oftentimes with all of those things comes more responsibility. And I will tell you that is not tremendously different when we look in the startup world. Because in the startup world, when we get a whole bunch of money and a whole bunch of responsibility, our life becomes more complicated. So let's pivot now to what actually is reality. I want to show you some reality of what it's like to be in the startup world. So here is there was a study performed probably 5 or 6 years ago now, and entrepreneurs are usually 2 times more likely to report having a mental health condition. We are 2 times more likely to suffer from depression. We are 6 times more likely to suffer from ADHD. We are 3 times more likely to suffer from substance abuse. This one is incredibly scary. We are 10 times more likely to suffer from bipolar disorder, 2 times more likely to have a psychiatric hospitalization, and 2 times more likely to have suicidal thoughts. So I actually wrote a book about 3 years ago that helps SaaS founders, software founders, build their company. And I oftentimes hand founders that book and I said, you know what, read this first. And if you're willing to sign up for all of this, then come back to me for help. I am absolutely happy to help you, mentor you, do consulting for you. But I'm telling you right now that there's a lot of baggage that comes from being an entrepreneur that we don't really know about. I actually have another talk that I talk a lot about the 10 taboos of being an entrepreneur. And self-care is something that nobody talks about when you are starting your company. What everybody does talk about is raising funds, getting rich, and achieving the American dream. And as we've already talked about, the American dream doesn't include happiness and really doesn't include wealth. So how does all of this happen? This is a word that you may or may not have heard of before, called negativity bias. So negativity bias is the notion that even with equal intensity, things of a more negative nature have a greater effect on one's psychological state and processes than neutral or positive things. To provide the best example of this, I would ask you, when was the last time that you went in and got a review by an employer? So you went into your boss and they gave you a review and they said, here are 9 things that you are doing amazing. You are doing these 9 things so well, better than anybody else in the company, but I'm going to give you one thing to start working on. Here's one opportunity for growth. How many of you leave that meeting and think about those 9 amazing things that your boss told you? Almost all of us leave and we think about that one thing that they told us that we were not doing good at. We punch ourselves in the face again and again and again because we did this one thing wrong and we ignore all of the things we did right. That is what is called negativity bias. And where this starts at is when we're infants. This is actually an evolutionary process. When we were running around as cavemen, anytime that we found something negative in our environment, that negative thing could potentially kill us. And we have not worked it out of our genetics at this point. So when we start hearing the word no as a child, in fact, as a child, about the time that we turn 3, we start hearing the word no 80% more than we hear the word yes. Don't touch this. Don't do that. Don't hurt your brother or sister. We hear no all of the time, and we are trained to begin thinking in negativity more so than positivity. Now, how does that actually change how we work and feel in this world? It's actually really simple. The way that we think changes the way that we feel. So when I have a negative thought, when my boss tells me that I have done something wrong, that causes a feeling inside of me. Now that feeling actually triggers a series of hormones. We have chemicals running through our body all the time. And those hormones cause us to do things. They usually cause us to act or enact or react, or in some cases, not act at all. So I think something, and then I feel something. I feel something, and then I do something. And all of those things that I do cause my reality. All of my actions create my reality. The actions that I take are creating my reality, not what somebody is doing to me. So I think, then I feel. I feel, then I do. Whatever I do creates my reality. And let me give you some other interesting information here. We have about 12 to 60,000 thoughts a day. 80% of those thoughts are negative. And 95% of those thoughts are repetitive. So what that means is, out of those potential 12,000 thoughts, 9,120 of those thoughts are negative. 9,000 out of 12,000 thoughts are negative. And if we come back to this idea that what I think is what I feel, and what I feel is what I do, and what I do is what creates my reality, now I have a problem, because 9,000 of those 12,000 thoughts are negative, and that is creating a negative reality for me. So step 3, we are going to look at a little investigation. We're going to do some investigation. And the first question that I'm actually going to ask you is not actually related to this specific topic, but it's going to set up how I want you to think about this. You've all heard of branding or brand. If you're thinking about starting a startup, you talk about, what is my brand going to be? And honestly, a lot of times people think of brand as colors and logo and things like that. And I would challenge you, and I would say that your brand is what customers say about you when you leave the room. So we obviously don't spend a lot of time in the same room with a customer, but if you're in a meeting, in a big Zoom meeting like this, my brand is what you are going to think and say about me when we close this Zoom meeting out. So the next question I want to ask you then is, how do you define culture? Brand and culture are somewhat related, but the way that I define culture is what your employees say about you when you leave the room. So if you're a CEO or one of the co-founders of your company, and you're having a Zoom meeting or an in-person meeting, and you walk out of that meeting, what do your employees say about you? Because that's the culture that you are building. So the next question I want to ask you is, where does culture come from? And for startups, culture originates from lived values of its founders. Now, it's really, really important that you look at the highlighted word here, at this italicized word. I want you to remember that the values that you imbue into your startup are your lived values. I work with a lot of companies who have these extraordinarily lofty values, and they come up with these amazing values that they want to post on their website that do not align in any way whatsoever to the values that they have in their company. So you as a founder need to determine what your lived values are, because those lived values are actually going to be what creates your culture. And then one more question: where do your values come from? And these values come from underlying beliefs and lived experiences. You absolutely were raised with certain values that created certain beliefs. You had things happen to you, positive or negative, as children, as middle schoolers, as high schoolers, as college kids, as adults. We've had things happen to us that create our underlying beliefs and our lived experiences. That is where values come from. So now I'm going to wrap all of this up in a really interesting diagram for you. Startup culture, because remember, what we're here to talk about is, how do I imbue, how do I put self-care into my startup? Startup culture, we know, comes from the values of the founders. Those founder values comes from the reality that I live in and my core beliefs. That reality comes from essentially what I do, my reality that I am creating on a day-to-day basis. And we know that what I do comes from how I feel. We know that how I feel comes from what I think. Remember, my thought creates how I feel. Those feelings create hormones. Those hormones cause me to act, react, enact. All of those actions create the reality that I live in. The reality that I live in creates the values that I possess as a founder, and those founders create a startup culture. Now, how do I change this? So maybe you do not have the values in your or in your startup that you want today. So if self-care is not a part of your startup culture today, how does this all happen? And I'm telling you, while this sounds like a sort of a scary word, and by psychic, I don't mean that you are foretelling the future. It's really a psychological change. I literally need to experience somewhat of a psychological change for me to build in self-care into my startup. So the last question that I'm going to ask and answer is, what really is a psychic change? And a psychic change is a shift in an individual's thoughts or desires, allowing them to enjoy a happy, joyous, and free life. Now, if you want to raise your hand or comment again, I would ask you, do you want to live the American dream, or do you want to live a happy, joyous, and free life? Because I think that's a very fundamental question that as a founder, you are going to need to ask yourself. Because if you want to live a happy, joyous, and free life, that is going to change the culture in your company. If you want to truly live the American dream, which is based on pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, working hard, and making as much money as you possibly can, then that's a different kind of culture. That's a different startup culture than having something with self-care. I'm not saying that you can't make money, and I'm not telling you to live in poverty by any means. We absolutely need money to run a company, and our employees need money to be happy. We already found out that satiation, happiness comes at about $95,000, depending on where you live. So we absolutely need money. I'm not disagreeing with that, but it is a fundamental shift on how much money you want to make or need to make, and whether or not you want to be happy, or whether you want to live the American dream. So the last step, what is our solution? I would ask you again, why you probably came to the conclusion that $1 million in some way would make you happy. And I would ask you, why does that $1 million make you happy? If I handed you this box full of $1 million right now, you would immediately get happy. And the next question I would ask you is why? Because that $1 million, I think that you would agree with me that that $1 million doesn't actually contain happiness. That box doesn't hold happiness. That box isn't made out of happiness. The cotton that makes up those dollar bills is not made out of happiness. So what is it in that $1 million that's making you happy? And it comes down to two very, very simple things. When I give you that $1 million, it is temporarily stopping you from craving something or from aversion. So if I give you that $1 million, you stop craving a new car because that $1 million is going to give it to you. If you are craving a newer, bigger, fancier house, that $1 million would stop your craving for a moment, or maybe for a little while. We don't know exactly how long the craving is going to stop, but we know from people who win the lottery, we've already talked about this, that the people who win the lottery, they're not happy for very long. So all that $1 million is doing is temporarily stopping your craving or temporarily stopping aversion. You stop wanting to feel a certain way. And why does that happen? Because everything that we feel and experience in this world is impermanent. Now, one of the phrases that you might be familiar with is the only thing that we know to be true or know to be permanent are death and taxes. Well, we know that taxes change oftentimes every year, if not 4 years. And we know that death is going to come at some point in time. But everything else in our life is impermanent. So that $1 million is just as impermanent as happiness is from me eating a bar of chocolate. When you eat a piece of chocolate, that chocolate makes you happy. But just like the $1 million, there is no happiness included in that chocolate. In fact, that chocolate is only creating hormones that are causing you to act in a little bit different way. There is no happiness in that chocolate more so than there is in that $1 million. The $1 million might make you happier a little bit longer because it might last a little longer than the chocolate does, but there is no happiness included in either one of those things. So here's the big return. And this is the only thing that I don't have proof for, that I can't give you proof for. In this entire presentation, I can't give you proof that our true nature is and always has been bliss. Self-care is just a pathway to bliss. And our true nature is bliss. We have simply forgotten how to access it. So when I give you that $1 million, all it is doing is we are stopping for a moment to desire something. And when we stop desiring something, it gives us an opportunity to feel the bliss that has always resided inside of us. The bliss is always there. The happiness is always there. I just have to stop wanting something long enough to feel it. Now, how does this relate to a startup? I coach, work with, mentor a lot of founders. And you would be amazed at how challenging it is to raise seed funding, Series A, whatever series you're working in. These founders bust their ass to raise money, and it's miserable. And you know what? They are just as miserable, if not more miserable, after they've raised $5 million as they were before it, because now they actually have somebody that they have to be accountable to. They might have somebody that's sitting on their board. They might have somebody that actually wants them to go out and make X amount of money in X amount of time. And they didn't have any of those requirements before they raised the $1 million or before they raised their seed round. But now they have more requirements. Now they have more aversions. They have an aversion to that person sitting on their board. They want more things. They want customers to sign more deals. It is once again back to craving and aversion. So what is the secret? What is the secret to self-care? We've already realized that building self-care into our company, into our values, requires a bit of a psychic change. So I will tell you right now, I have a firm belief that work-life balance is total bullshit. There is no such thing as work-life balance. What we need to do is figure out how to integrate both of our lives. Work life and personal life seem to be, and people treat them as two different things. We put our personal life at the door and we walk into work. We leave work and then we put our personal hat back on before we go home. That is impossible. We only have one life, so we need to integrate as much as possible. And the way that we do that, the way that I propose people do that, is through the 80-20 rule or the Pareto principle, meaning that if we have 80% of our time devoted towards running our company and 20% devoted towards self-care, we will actually begin integrating self-care into our life on a day-to-day basis. So that means that out of every 8 hours I have to work, 2 more hours have to be spent in self-care. And you might be wondering, how am I going to do that? How am I going to spend 2 hours a day in yoga and meditation? Well, I will tell you it's a lot easier than that. There are 4 different ways that we can integrate self-care into our life. So self-care and ourselves are this middle dot, and I usually start off in the physical body. The physical body, then I move to the mental body, then I move to the emotional body and the spiritual body. This is the path of someone who wants to build self-care and happiness, true happiness, purpose, and fulfillment into their life. So what does that mean? The physical body, a lot of you are already doing it. You're already incorporating exercise and movement into your life. You're already getting sleep. You're already getting fresh water into your body. You're eating healthy, fresh, organic foods. You might be getting massage and body work. You might be taking the appropriate supplements. You might be spending time in nature. If you want to know a little bit more about Ayurveda, this presentation will be available on my website in about an hour after we finish. But you can go out, click on this link to take what's called the dosha quiz. This is some holistic Indian medicine, and you can figure out what foods, what seasons are best equipped for you to take care of your body. So again, 2 hours a day. If you're working 8 hours a day, you need 2 hours a day of self-care. If you can spend an hour eating a healthy meal with your family with your phone off, that's 1 hour of self-care. If you can spend an hour in exercise, yoga, movement, meditation, there's another hour of self-care. That's all it takes. And this sort of has to be done on a daily basis, but it can be done on a weekly basis, but you're going to have to do a lot of catch up on the weekends if you are working 16 hours a day on your startup. So moving beyond the physical body, we move into the mental body. What does this mean? So I'm at the gym one day. Somebody tells me, you know what, you should really get healthy. So I start going to the gym and I'm running on the treadmill. And all of a sudden somebody says, you know what, you should really read this book called The Happiness Project, or you should really listen to this podcast from Brene Brown. She's really interesting. Now we start engaging our mental body. We start learning. We read, we write, we have some intellectual growth. So I am taking care of my body. Now I'm taking care of my mind. Now, at some point in time, you're going to hear something from the Happiness Project or Brene Brown that says, I don't really understand that, or that doesn't make me feel very good. At that point in time, we start to feel emotions. You feel emotions on a regular basis. You oftentimes don't pay a lot of attention to them. We get angry, we get sad, we get happy. We really focus on the major primary emotions. But once we start moving into the emotional body, we start looking at things like therapy and coaching, self-reflection and journaling. One of the best ways that we can begin developing our emotional body is both practicing forgiveness and compassion. And one of Brene Brown's commonalities that she finds among the most wholehearted people that she's ever interviewed is a gratitude practice, being able to write down the things that you are grateful for. Because when I am grateful for things, I stop wanting other things. When I stop wanting other things, I am ceasing my desire. When I cease my desire, the inside happiness, my internal bliss, gets to come out and play. Finally, we can approach the spiritual body. And I'm very specific here when I talk about the spiritual body, because I work with a lot of people that are agnostic, that are atheists, and I do not mean religion when I talk about the spiritual body. And I'm going to talk about the difference here in just a moment. But what I really mean when we move into the spiritual body, this is about self-knowledge and awareness. So I want to know myself. I want to study consciousness, potentially religion. If you are a religious person, religion can be a part of spirituality. It can be a path to spirituality. But I don't care if you are Christian, if you are Hindu, if you are Muslim, if you are Jews. I believe that all roads lead to Rome. So regardless of our path, when we begin to incorporate self-knowledge, that is going to bring happiness into our world. This is where meditation and prayer come into play. We learn to work potentially with energy. That might be Reiki or Qigong or Tantra, depending on the practice that you are most interested in. I highly encourage, I in fact attended a 10-day silent meditation retreat this year that was truly life-changing for me. And entheogens are also, in a safe and legal way, a way to begin to experience the spiritual body. Now, we're about done. I got just a couple of things that I wanted to mention here to kind of wrap everything up. So, as I mentioned before, religion and spirituality are two very different things. And you can read these definitions when you want to, but I'm going to tell you right now that religion is often based on a group of people. It is a series of beliefs and practices and rituals that combine a group of people together. Spirituality is about yourself. It is an individual practice about self-exploration and knowledge. How you choose to practice your spirituality is 100% up to you. And it does not require a religion. You can do enormous amounts of self-exploration and knowledge without ever studying any religion whatsoever. So to wrap all of this stuff up, I would just tell you that our true nature, if you believe our true nature is bliss, the better that we know each other, ourselves rather, the better that we know ourselves, the happier we become. If what lives inside of us is true happiness, I do not have to actually look outside for money or funding or chocolate or whatever it is that makes you happy. You do not actually have to look outside for those things because it already lives inside of you. All you have to do is stop desiring something long enough to feel the bliss that actually lives inside of you. So the better we know ourselves, the happier we can become. I've got a few minutes left for questions. There was a whole bunch of stuff in there. I'm going to post all of this stuff on the website. You'll find it at gbfreeman.com/blog. I'll also send out an email to everybody once the presentation is uploaded. But with that, I'm going to pause and see what you guys have to say or any questions that you might have.